Ben and I have been talking, and there is a lot of synergy between the way we both are thinking. Now, this is a presentation that I gave at the WOSC in September that Igor organized. I modified it, and I'll try to keep it as brief as possible. So I want to talk about a generalized theory of open system evolution by interaction. And it can be studied through an interface. That is the theme of the talk. And I'm going to say that this kind of gets us into a concept called Socio-Cybernetics or cybernetics third generation or whatever it is, third order cybernetics, which I'm going to rephrase as system of systems. And you can take the system of systems all the way from self to a self to society, that is going from a micro nano scale to a meso scale to a cosmic scale or a whole species-wide scale. So this is how I want to build this. I'm a research affiliate in Professor Murugan Kasur's lab at MIT. And as I said before, the three things that guide my work is, first is, besides matter and energy, I'd like to include information as the third leg of the discussion on understanding systems. And then the second thing is, if you're talking about biology, nothing can be learned in biology except in the light of evolution. That is, you have to see how the whole system evolved, and the evolution happens by interaction. And of course, I have to confess that I'm really standing on the shoulders of a lot of big scientists and innovators, and using their experiments and data. And my work is all thought processes. Okay. So break it into a few sections here. The first is to talk about what are systems, what is systems thinking, and what I mean by generalized systems theory. I'll talk briefly about my understanding of the brain, because this is what I started doing. And I actually, like what Ben was saying, I stumbled into cybernetics by looking at the brain, but looks like most of the cybernetics pioneers really started also sort of in the same way. They studied brain and built the cybernetics concept. And I have a very simple model of the cybernetics process. And I'll also talk about how this general systems theory applies not just to brain, but to language and consciousness and other things. Okay. So first, what is a system? By system, it is actually, what I mean is a whole that is an assembly of interacting parts. Just one second. I can't see any of you here. How do I see? That's no good. Sorry.
It's okay. We are all smiling.
I'm sorry?
I say we are everybody smiling, so you don't have to always you just concentrate on your stuff.
Okay, that's fine. Yeah, the whole is the assembly of interacting parts, and each part itself could be a system by itself. Okay, so we start off with a broad definition of system like that, a whole, and come. Then the next thing is, what is systems thinking? Okay, I'll describe it in the next slide. And how does the concept of cybernetics fits into this systems thinking applied to systems? Okay, a first order cybernetics with a feedback loop, second order with the external regulator, and what we are now calling like third order is looking at interdependent interactions and how these open systems evolve. That's the next level of cybernetics. Okay. So I'll just jump on to this. So a system consists of parts, but what is systems thinking is we really have to break it into three different viewpoints. One is, what is the hardware implementation or the structure? The second one is, how do you represent the input-output and the algorithm that connects the input-output? That is, you can call it as a function. But these two are tied to something above, which is the process, which also is the information about why does the system do what it does. So if you want to understand the system, a holistic approach or systems thinking is to use all these three different viewpoints. And if they all converge and say the same thing, then I feel we have a holistic explanation of the system that we are discussing. Okay. Then typically most of the science that we have learned all deal with a closed system where the system just has fixed boundaries, whereas living systems and in general most systems that we look at, they actually exchange information, matter, and energy with the environment or with other systems. And that is what enables the living beings to survive and to adapt for the future. And I'm going to say that when you talk about interaction, you have to have two complementary entities. It could be two different systems or a system and its environment. They are distinct, but they are interdependent. That is the key part here. And say the open systems self-organize by interacting, and typically because these two systems could have very different physical mechanisms, you need a sort of interpreter or a translator in between, and there is an interface that connects the two systems together. And the important thing here is the mass and energy are not conserved during the open system interaction. There are no boundary and initial conditions. There is no equilibrium. There is only flow. So the way we need to analyze the open system is to look at it as a progression of state changes. That is, a system is characterized by a state, and a state itself is defined in terms of parameters. And we need to look at the change in parameters defining different states. And the individual systems are the parts. What happens inside the physical mechanism is not we don't need to get into it when we are looking at the interactions between the systems. And the process by which an open system evolves can be thought of as a reciprocal control and communication. That is, you have an observer and doer if you're talking about a behavior control system, and we have an observer and observed if you're talking about a knowledge management system. And in this reciprocal control communication, there is no centralized control. That is, the interactions are nested dynamic, and they happen at various spatio-temporal scales. And most of the state changes happen at a synchronized point between the two interacting entities, and it comes out as like an avalanche-like emergent behaviors. This is how I would model the system, and I'll talk about it later. Okay, so first we'll take a quick look at the brain. So before we start, so we need to have, as I said, first we need to have a theory. That is, why do we need a brain? First, because I'm body and mind operating in this world at this instant, and I'm consciously experiencing and thinking. In order to facilitate these things, I need a human brain, and this one provides learning, memory, and recall. And it is composed of nested reciprocal self-organized ensembles of complementary entities. A mouthful of words. Okay, so simple way to look at this is we have a body and a mind, and they communicate with each other through this brain. And the brain consists of self-organized structural maps. It has neuromodulators that produce emotional states. And then there is also static connections that are enabled by these neural maps, which actually map the reflex activity. This is what I was talking about, Ben. That is, we need to pair sensations and actions. And this is like an N by M matrix, and N and M are infinitely large. So this portion of the brain, we can call it as the perceptive or a physical domain, and it is dealing with the instantaneous sensory motor reflexes. Then the next part is the cognitive domain or the knowledge control system. So this is the behavioral part of it. This is the knowledge part of it. And what happens here is the experiences become memorized representations, and we have the ability to recall those experiences and use that learning to guide our future behavior. And that is the reason for the existence of this cognitive brain. And beyond the cognitive brain, the specialty of the human beings is the social brain, where we build the cultural norms and values over a lifelong learning and generations, passed on through generations. And that has been enabled by the symbolic language Okay. And then we can talk about the input to the body. It comes in as analog energy and immediately gets converted into discrete pulses. And the pulses get chunked into frames. And those frames become like if you're talking about the language side of it, phoneme, syllables, and words. And then the mind portion of it creates sequences of these words by associative memory, and that becomes the episodic and semantic memories. And from there, you build the symbolic language, which are the sequences. When you assign labels to these sequences, it becomes a symbolic language. So this is the model of the brain that I have been working on. And how does this map into a cybernetic process? So originally, when we started with first order cybernetics, here is an input and output, and there is a system, and it was just mapping it. And if you take part of the response back into it, which is like a velocity controller, then you get the first order feedback loop system. This is how the basic cybernetics started. But then people like Ashby added a regulator to this. So the regulator, what it does is it learns connections between the input and output, and context-dependent manner in an appropriate way, it feeds back a recommendation on what response to take to an input. So this is what I was talking about. Then that is it is like one step at a time, and the response comes out as an emergent phenomenon immediately for a given sensation. We'll talk a little bit more about that. But so this is the second order cybernetics model. But instead of thinking about this regulator as a standalone observer that is doing this, developing this map, if the regulator itself becomes a self-sustained system, that is, if you think of it as a mind has its own existence and the body has its own existence. If you break it into those two parts, then you need an interface in between, which is what I presented in the previous slide. And that's how I got into this as a brain consisting of a perceptive part and a cognitive part and a midbrain translator, because these are all different forms of energy, sound, light, and pressure, and all those things coming in. Whereas the cognitive brain is just processing sequence of pulses, and it is doing digital signal processing and pulse sequencing. So we need a system that converts this input into this type of output that the mind can understand. So that is why you need an interface. Okay. So what is the function of this interface? It pairs varieties. That is, the variety is, I'm defining it as a reflex, which is a mapping between sensation and action. Okay. And this is the N by M set of, that is, for every sensation, there are multiple attractors, which are the actions. And for every action, there are multiple sensations that are possible. And those are the mutual attractors for each other. And any particular behavior is a specific set chosen by context and value. But you need to start this system with a bootstrapping. That is, we ought to be born with some innate reflexes. And initially, the child itself during the critical period and other times learns a lot of physical reflexes. And then afterwards, we start creating relations in the mental part of it. And that becomes the cerebral reflexes. Now, the association by the mind happens in two different ways. They're called operant conditioning and classic conditioning. So a sensation now actually can trigger a reflex. But that is, a sensation triggers an action, but the action is already tied to a sensation. That means sensation went to action to sensation. But this sensation itself is mapped onto more actions, more reflexes, and that contain again actions and sensations. So you can just see very quickly one type of pairing leads to a very large chain. So this is the reflexive operation. This is the association operation, or the reciprocal recursive operation. And by recursion, you can create an infinitely long memory. Okay. So we need, and then after creating the memory, you need to be able to take the memory and turn it into action. That is, cognition has to become a thought, and the thought has to be expressed as an action. And that requires a common language between the regulator, which is the mind, and the primitive transformer, which is the body. Okay, so that portion is the neuronal language that I'll get into if we have time. So essentially, brain, the internal neuronal network, is a recursive interface between body, mind, and world. And actually, what is interesting with this model is this system is highly vulnerable to failures. For example, this chain is only as strong as its weakest link. And at the between the perceptive brain and the rest of it, if there is a breakage, then the perceptive brain, it is just engulfed in the input-output mapping, and we get into what is the artistic spectral disorders or the obsessive compulsive disorders, that kind of things. On the other hand, if the cognitive brain is stuck and it becomes overpowering, then we get psychotic diseases like the schizophrenia and bipolar disorder and those kind of things. And what is even more interesting is the midbrain also has a weakness. Midbrain is basically a lot of neuromodulators. And if the neuromodulators like the norepinephrine and acetylcholine and the dopamine and the serotonin, if they go bad, then you can end up getting like anxiety disorders. And then the acetylcholine going bad can lead to Alzheimer's, and then the dopamine failure leads to Parkinson's disease, and then the serotonin leads to depression. You get the SSRI. So you can see this chain has problems, and any artificial system that is built like this with this kind of things is going to have all those vulnerabilities too. So when we emulate brain, we can end up creating biases and weaknesses, and we will have all the human sufferings showing up in the artificial model of the brain too. So what I have done is I talked about what is systems thinking, a brief introduction to the cybernetics, and the first order cybernetics is the feedback loop. Second order is the regulator. The third order is treating this as two independent units with an interface, and that is what leads to the next step here. This regulator can actually become a social brain because then the individual who contains these things now can interact with each other, and the social brain becomes like the collective internet or the whole species level brain. And if you have a disease between here and here, if the person is incapable of understanding what I called in the previous slide, the function of a social brain, which is the norms and values, if the person cannot abide by the norms and values, then the failure of the social brain makes the person a narcissist. So you can see there are vulnerabilities everywhere. So moving on, I'll just give some hardware implementation and also a short mathematical interpretation on how to think about this third order or the social cybernetics interaction modeling. So the very beautiful model that was generated by Professor Herman Trout and Nancy Koppel from BU is to build a very simple microcircuit. You have two excitatory systems and two inhibitory systems, and you can chain them like this, like an infinity. So if, just a second. So you, oops. So they developed this as a temporal coding model. So the excitation triggers the inhibition then suppresses this, and then this can trigger this and it can suppress this. So they can kind of go back and forth ping pong. So one direction you can call it as communication, the other direction you can call it as control. And so by reciprocal communication and control, this microcircuit basically becomes the basis of all brain networks. This is the fundamental canonical microcircuit that we have in the brain. Okay, even though they developed it as a microcircuit, they actually called it as said that the spikes encode information about the synchronization process rather than the information directly related to inputs. So this circuit represents the cybernetic process control and communication. Now you can take this E1 and E2 as two different neurons or two different synapses. Okay. Or we can just think about it as just one single neuron. A single neuron itself contains three different parts. One is the dendrites that collects sensations or input from all the other neurons. And then it has an axon that sends neurotransmitters to the next neurons. That is, you can think about it like a recursive feedback coming here, but actually it goes to other neurons here. And in between in the body, there are basal dendrites that also take input. So this becomes context. This is the feedback from the regulator, or this is the input from the world. And this is the feed forward to the next stage of the circuit. Okay. But what is interesting is then when you see three of these things together, it reminds us immediately of a transistor with a collector junction, a base junction, and an output emitter junction. So once you think of this as a transistor, then you can build a flip-flop circuit with two transistors and two RC circuits. And one of the RC circuit could be a low pass and the other one could be a high pass. Then they will end up with different cutoff frequencies. And what is interesting about this is we took this basic model here, this I1, I2 are the two RC filters, the E1, E2 are these two transistors, and we can build a circuit that will go flip-flop or a ping-pong, and they can have two different frequencies or two different periods over which one is active, and then during the next period, another one is active. So this circuit becomes a fundamental hardware implementation of a phenomenal cybernetic process with variable periods that are getting concatenated. One is providing the communication, the other one is providing the control. So this is the fundamental thing. And what is also very good to know is the professor I work with, Professor Murugan Kasur, and a lot of others have worked on even in the early 80s and showed that if you look at the different sensory cortices in the brain, actually they all have very similar type of circuit performance, and it can actually take the input from the visual neurons and feed it into the auditory cortex, and the auditory cortex will function like a visual cortex. So so essentially this becomes the canonical hardware implementation. So I talked about the theory, talked about the hardware implementation. Then we can talk about the algorithm next. Okay, so I have a very simple matrix model of the interaction process. And it starts off with a fundamental statement developed by Professor Raymond Guillory. What he says is each message SN must be related to the anticipated action and its sensory consequence. This is what I was talking about as associated memory. That is, a sensation is associated to a reflex. The reflex is the anticipated action and its sensory consequence. So association is between an input to a pair of activity, a paired activity, a reflex operation. So you can just write it like an equation. Sn plus 1 is Mn operating on Sn. Okay. Then you can take these two equations here, that is the reflexive operation and then the association operation, and you can write it like a matrix here. Mn plus 1 here is 0 times Mn plus this, that is Sn. and Sn plus 1 is equal to Mn plus Mn and Sn convolution. So these are not arithmetic operations. These are more mapping functions. But the interesting thing about this very simple matrix that we are looking at has eigenpairs of golden ratios. And even the eigenvectors are golden ratios. Okay. So what it says
fantastic.
is, go ahead.
Fantastic. Fantastic.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Thank you. So this is, the system parameter then scales by the eigenvalues. And if you're thinking about it as a temporal operation, then the time step between one stage to the next stage scales by the eigenvalue of 1.618. That is in the forward communication direction. And if you're talking about the reverse control direction, this will be the reciprocal of the other golden ratio, and the time will keep shrinking. Whereas the population will be going in the opposite direction. You start with a lot of input and you keep on reducing it, eventually turning it into a single concept. So it's a cascade of operations, and that is the mapping functions that you get from the brain. This is a simple mathematical model that
Ram, can I stop you here?
Sure.
Because if you're not being interrupted, you will go to the rest of the story. But I like that one really much. Basically, what you see, if we have kind of supportive iterations of communication, it will go up in volume or quantity or whatever in a basically golden ratio form. And if you have let's call it undesired communication, it will go down with the same ratio. Is this something, if I understand it correctly, or am I missing it?
No, but how I want to explain this is actually a little more involved. This is like a time and space mapping too. That is, these actions are all, what I have as M is actually a populations of neuron. It's a neuronal frame. It's a large populations. Sensation is again a set of neurons population, and the population number essentially represents like a space. So we can think about it as population changing from one step to the next step. And also all actions happening through matter cannot happen instantaneously. It takes some amount of time. And I'm sorry, there's a lot more detail that I'm not showing here, that the time progression also has to scale from one stage to the other. So what I'm saying is, as you go from one stage to the next stage, the time it takes for communication increases by this golden ratio 1.618, whereas the populations of neurons, which is dimensionality reduction, is going to shrink. So in my eye, I have 6 million cones, let us say. That's a lot of pixels that are coming in, but most of the pixels are not necessarily containing the signal that is of any context and relevance to me, and most of those neurons would be suppressed, and the rest of the neurons would be taken into, let us say, if you think of neurons as points, you can connect them into lines, and the lines can be connected to surfaces and surface into volumes. So there's, at every step, the image processing takes this large number of neurons and keeps on reducing them. And those neurons actually represent certain information. That is, initially they represented points of light. Then they represented lines of some edges. And the lines, when they connect together, they represent a surface, and multiple surfaces represent volume, and the volume becomes the object. So you can see image processing is a sequence of operations. And I'm saying in each sequence, if you look at the way the brain operates, it takes certain amount of time, and the ratio of the scaling of the time is this golden ratio, whereas the population size goes in the opposite direction. So during feed-forward communication, population shrinks, time increases. Whereas in the reverse, if I have a thought and I want to express it into the action, then the time would be decreasing as I go from the innermost sanctum of my brain and going towards my outer limbs. The time will be getting shorter and shorter. Quicker actions are taking place towards the limbs. And so time will be reducing by this 0.618 ratio, whereas the number of neurons involved would start to increase. I start with one single concept. Oh, I want to drink coffee. And from there, if you look at the amount of muscle movements and other things that I need to do, by the time I get to moving my body, there is a whole slew of cells that are operating. So there is dimensionality reduction in one direction, dimensionality increase in the other direction. That is what I'm trying to say. So that is why you need reciprocal eigenvalues here. And the beautiful thing about it, but this is one special case where there is a lot of synchrony between stages here. Okay, this is I'm not saying this is the universal thing. Every system, like if you take a government is not going to operate by these things. I'm kind of a brain bigot, and I'm looking at brain here, and that this is how I developed this.
Rem, are you aware of Hans von Forster's early work on memory?
Who's one?
Hans von Forster.
Yeah.
No,
I haven't read Forrest. I downloaded Forrester's book. I haven't read that yet. No.
Yeah, I think there are some connections here because from his work about memory, he developed this idea named non-trivial machine. And the non-trivial machine explained the brain creativity pretty nicely.
Okay.
I think there's some connection here that you may incorporate.
I will read. Okay, I'll definitely read.
Could I ask a question here, Ron?
Yeah, of course, of course.
So I'm really quite fascinated by this connection that you've achieved, which I presume is mathematically sound, et cetera, with the golden ratio and all that implies, both for philosophy as well as mathematics. But it's unclear in my mind exactly what are the units of dimensionality that you're referring to.
That is what
the Coulombic units, or
say that again.
Are they Coulombic units? You say dimensionality is changing. Dimensionality of what?
Yeah, no, the dimensionality here is population number. For example, if you're talking about neurons, assembly of neurons, and if you're talking about the dimensionality, if it is time within the central midbrain portion of our brain, the time scale is very short, goes between 1 millisecond to 1 second. So that is like the mesoscale. That's why in the beginning I said cell to self to society. So I'm focusing on the self part of it, and within the self part, the midbrain, which is mapping the body to the mind, and that works in the range of 1 millisecond to 1 second. And within that 1 millisecond, I'll show you in the next slide that how it scales, how this ratio shows up. So
go ahead.
This is not a mathematical operation. It is really a mapping function, right?
I understand perfectly well what you mean. Okay.
Yeah. Thank you.
Next slide.
Okay. So if you now take this same equation here, another beautiful thing that comes out, Sn plus 1 is Mn Sn, but Sn itself is Mn minus 1 Sn minus 1. But Sn minus 1 is Mn minus 2 Sn minus 2. If you keep on doing that, then all you end up with is all the S's are gone, and the Sn plus 1 starts from, takes us to S1. The only thing you need to know is the M's. Why is this a big deal? If I'm thinking of my mind as the one that is storing all the actions or the motor commands, the mind needs to store only motor commands. In fact, I'm claiming that the mind, because it is a pattern engine, it can only store the patterns and activate sets of neurons. It can't really activate anything in my body directly, right? So the mind is like a MIDI processor. It just issues command signals. And the beautiful thing is, if it wants to if it starts with this concept, high-level concept, I want to play this symphony, then all you have to do is keep on issuing motor commands, and every one of them will take you into each successive notes, and you get the whole symphony at the end. So the memory is just command signals. And the other thing is the sensations. This is where your question is, Jerry, that is, sensations have energy which have units. But within the mind, there are no units, right? We are not born with any kind of scaling systems inside, and we don't know how to measure time and space in the mind. So there are no units in the mind. It's only a Boolean operation or a topological mapping, but that's really all it needs. So if you start with the simple reflex recursive operation, right away you can build a model of the mind which says that all I have is motor commands, and if I just store all of them in the sequence, then I can go from a high-level concept to a low-level operation right away. So this is, and then each one of these pairs, Mn minus 1, Sn minus 1, each one of these reflexes, they are basically mapping of attractors between sensations and actions. So the whole thing becomes extremely simple. So then this is why I was saying, instead of using the word spectrum, if you think of it as n by m mapping, then these attractor dynamics becomes very attractive to implement. It is very easy to do it. I don't know whether I'm making sense to you folks.
Oh yeah.
Do you follow?
So far, what you have been talking about is purely the electronic processes along those lines, right?
No, no, actually, no. It is really in the brain. You know, people keep talking about ions and electrical things, but actually, biology is all biochemistry, molecular biology, and genetics.
That's what I was trying to say, that because Hans von first used that donut model to illustrate that beside one circle of this electronics signals from sensor to motor and back to sensor, that's electronics. There is another circle of chemical stuff going on. Your items, your all kinds of environmental or context signals that you call it context. Actually, I call the context culture.
Okay.
So maybe that can be further incorporated in your work.
Jason,
no, it is incorporated here. Sorry, go ahead, Derek.
Ram, let me address Jason's issue because I think it's crucial here. At the time of Heinz van Foster, and he was born, what, 1920 or so?
1911.
Pardon?
1911.
1911. So the entire corpus of biochemical knowledge was almost entire corpus, I should say, was simply unavailable for him to think about. And so he used a very simplified language that was technically adequate for the state of electronics at that time. And that, I mean, clearly is the work of genius, as you well know. But the language available for him to describe the events that Ram is talking about simply was not available. And so he uses a vastly simplified mathematics, a vastly simplified geometry and syntax. Yeah, syntax is the word I'm looking for. So both his syntax and semantics were very primitive relative to the sophistication Ram is presenting. Correct?
Yeah.
So we are doing, Ram is doing a great progress here.
Yes.
Well, thank you. Jason, if you look at this first statement is very critical. If you look at this, the whole model is talking about a message being represented with actions and sensation. If you see here, there is no electricity, right?
I mean, the
only reason
of executing this the signals is basically beep 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 beep. That little signal going through.
but
the chemical side is not involved with beep beep beep, but it controls the beep 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 sequence.
But
no,
what I
see,
think
the
I think
reason
what
why you need the electricity is the membranes, they have a resting state potential at a certain minus 65 millivolts, right? And they will start to conduct, and the pores would open up and let the neurotransmitters from the presynaptic terminal to flow into the postsynaptic terminal only if the membrane reaches a certain potential. And the electrical ions are needed. The sodium, when it comes in, it raises locally the membrane potential. That's really all the electricity does. All the action in the brain is based on neurotransmitters and neuromodulators and the receptors. See, the receptors are the ones that open and let the electricity go in, right? So if you think about it, what does the receptor act as? It is like a channel and producing conductance. So what the biochemistry does is really changes the conductance of the membrane by by putting a receptor there.
Changing the parameter of the transfer function. If you model the electricity process with a transfer function, and then there is in your function, in your formula, they should have different kind of parameters. But those parameters, when you consider only the electronic process, considered as constant. But actually, when the chemistry process is going on, your emotion kicks in, and they change, actually they modified, or you call modified those parameters to make your transfer function different from another status.
No.
So that was why I was trying to.
No.
No?
Every neuron acts over the same range of potentials, or every membrane, I should say. See, neuron is a bad thing to look at. Neuron is like saying whole of Amazon factory. Each neuron is a huge, humongous factory. But what we are interested in is one synapse where a dendrite, which is a collector junction, is picking up the neurotransmitters coming through the vesicles of the presynaptic boton, which is the emitter junction. So the emitter junction of one neuron connects to the collector junction of the second neuron, and what passes through them is not electricity first. What passes through them is neurotransmitters. The neurotransmitter being the AMPA and the GABA, those things, and those
chemicals, in other words, chemicals.
Chemicals. These are all, everything that happens in the brain is chemicals. Okay, and those chemicals, they are basically one chemical from the presynaptic terminal opens the receptor in the second part of the membrane belonging to another neuron. But how did this receptor come into play? That comes from biochemistry, which is when the neuromodulators go in, they release C-amps, and the C-amps go into the nucleus, and they release the RNA. RNA then codes for a certain protein, and the protein is the receptor, and the receptor goes and lodges into the membrane. So you can see that the whole action, it's all chemicals. It's biochemistry, genetics triggering biochemistry and causing molecular biology to happen. So the genes produce eventually the proteins, and the proteins, which are the receptors, now are going to let in, are opened and closed by the neurotransmitter coming from the previous neuron or previous membrane. And when that opens up, the pore size is just the right size to let the sodium ions in. And the sodium on the outside of the neuron is very high volume. That's called the Nernst potential, and it immediately rushes into the neuron. And when ions are moving, rate of change of ions is current, right? I equals d.
I was trying to emphasize the difference between our rational processes versus our emotional processes. For example, the emotion of fear or emotion of anger, and those are all chemicals, right, Jerry?
Yes.
So those different chemicals
right here.
influence your circuit.
I said it again.
Oh, I mean, those emotional chemicals are actually influencing your transfer function on the main road, so to speak.
Yes, that's what I'm saying. Emotion function. Emotion, the neurons that are coding for emotions, and those are connecting, for example, sensory neurons to while going to the thalamus, they also go through hypothalamus, and the hypothalamus is the one that releases the neuromodulators, the serotonin and dopamine and norepinephrine and the acetylcholine, and those neuromodulators, and those are the ones that then go into the neuronal membrane or the neuronal body and causes the receptors to be released and the conductance to change. And only when the conductance changes, when the pores open up, the ions can flow through. So the emotion is coded by having actually two different paths. This is the beauty of GPS versus looking at your road atlas. See, when you look at the road atlas, all you have is the static maps. Whereas in GPS, it also knows the local weather conditions and local road closures and all kinds of things, which are the context. And the GPS decides which route you're going to take. So out of the n by m possibilities, the GPS tells you only one trajectory and also gives you only one step at a time. And that's exactly what the brain does here. And this is the short-term memory that is triggered by the neuromodulators. And that, out of all the possible sensation action pairs, it selects which one is the most relevant for the current sensation. So yes, it does go into the electrical circuit side of it, but the electrical part is really the trivial part, just raising the membrane voltage so that the neuron would open and close. See, it is the gating mechanism. That is, if the membrane stays open constantly, it is like the whole ocean emptying into a bucket, right? You don't want to do that. You need to very quickly open and close things.
Jerry,
so the membrane.
Oh, yeah, I just want to point out, Ram, that and Jason, that when talking about properties of the mind as a total, or really the body as a total, not just the mind, but the body in total, when you express emotions or that sort of thing, you are in the language now talking about the whole system. You're not talking about individual parts of the system, or particularly not individual neurons. The combinatorics of the behavior of individual neurons has to be considered for all of the neurons together before you can talk about emotions.
That's right.
So it's a combinatorial aspects of huge numbers of separate identity functions, if you would, that are necessary in order to create emotions. And this is more or less like
higher level emergence.
Yeah, the amount of water on the sands of the beach as a wave comes in. This is a terrible metaphor. I drop it. Terrible metaphor.
Yeah. So I think what I should have said is this M and S are vectors. These are vectors. Okay.
So basically, you're talking about information. This equation is about information, not about matter. Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So this is the message that is being relayed through this reflex operation here. So this is actually information processing, but the information itself has to have some relevance to the organism, and that is where the neuromodulators come in. And that make context and valence. Yeah.
May I ask you something?
Yeah.
And I'll try to read it, because each message must be related to the anticipated action and its sensory consequences. Now, message, it depends, where are you standing? Are you receiving the message or are you sending the message?
It can be both.
Yeah.
It can be both ways. See, if you are receiving the message from the outside world, you call it a communication from the outside through the body sensory organs into the mind, right?
Mm-hmm.
Whereas if you're talking the other way around, that I have a certain memory that has been evoked by a neuromodulator secretion for some reason, and that expression of that memory is the thought. And the thought has to be turned into action. So the thought has to be turned into action. When in that case, these three terms have to be switched. I should put it as each motor command Mn must be related to the anticipated sensation Sn plus 1 and the next motor action to be taken Mn plus 1. Okay, so the M and S are reciprocal. So depending on whether the message is going from outside in or inside out, this S and M become reciprocal operations. That is the beauty of this. So once you have a reflex operation and a reciprocal, it becomes recursive. And actually, Lewis Kaufman has a paper that he wrote in, I think in 70s, he explains that reflex becomes recursive.
Ram, this is exactly where I kind of came at information theory and cognition from. And so you're hitting a lot of where there's overlap in our work that, I looked at this through the lens of recursive information processing as the system is, attempting to maintain coherence and adapt to its environment. And that looks differently at different layers. So at a very instinctual or reflexive level, the information processing is very simple, and the variety of that information external is going to be more simplistic. And so in my model, consciousness then emerges as a variety to respond to the external variety of information that is more abstract and more complex. And so this is where the dimensions that you mentioned come in as you get this higher level of recursivity and the emergence of these different neuronal processes that are happening. That's where we start to see the same behaviors, but they take a slightly different, view, or they seem different in reality. But at the end of the day, it's still the same. We're still talking about the same process. So yeah, very much overlap in what we've been and what I was thinking about as well.
Yeah. Yes. Okay. So moving on, there's just a quick example here. These are the EEG data, and in the EEG data, you see different frequencies of peaks. Okay, and these are taken from different regions of the brain. And each region of the brain has an enormous amount of collection of neurons, and all those tiny signals, when they all combine together, it becomes a signal large enough for the EEG probe to pick up. And what we are seeing is that I don't like to use the frequencies. I've switched to the corresponding period, which is the inverse of the frequency. The activity is happening at 25 millisecond intervals, 640, 65, 105, 170, 275, 445. These are the peaks that you're getting. And what is beautiful about this is if you look at these ratios, they are all 1.6, about 1.618. That is what I was talking about as the golden ratio. And you can see it from different ways of doing this experiment. They end up with exactly the same thing. And so this is happening 25 millisecond or 40 hertz is called the gamma. 65 milliseconds is called the low, or around 16 is the low beta. 170 is called the theta, and then the 445 is the delta. Now, this is happening in the primary sensory cortices area where when a signal, okay, first of all, the analog signal has to be discretized. You have to create digital frames, and that is what is happening at this period here. So every 25 millisecond, you get a frame. that is coming in. The analog is all gone. Now all we have is a digital frame. Digital frame meaning a collection of neurons that are synchronously firing every 25 milliseconds. It's one frame of data that is coming in. That frame has to be parsed, and you need to issue a motor command to make some meaning out of that full set of data. That is, if this is the signal coming from the retina, then you issue a command to the oculomotor muscle in order to do a zoom, a pan, a focus, stereo vision, okay? And then essentially what those motor commands do is align the optic axis between the observer, the center of our eye, and the center of the image screen, which is the retina. So the object and the center of the lens and the image, they all become one line aligned. That optic axis alignment is actually a motor action. So your eye is a digital camera, highly motorized and synchronized between two different lenses, where it can change its radius of curvature, can change the aperture, it can move to the left and right, up and down, all of those things. And they are happening at this beta time frame commands. And very quickly, you can make some sense out of the signal that is coming in. Then the 170, now I'll kind of switch to auditory system. When you switch in the auditory system, this is like a phoneme or a consonant. Then when you get to the 170, this now becomes a syllable, which is a consonant vowel pair. And every 170 seconds is the marker that says, hey, I got a syllable. That's a consonant vowel boundary here. And you take two of those syllables and combine them with a little alpha, frontal alpha motor action that takes place in the basal ganglia. When you do that, that becomes a 445 millisecond. That is the word. Now, if you think about it, even in the computer, you have bits, bytes, and words. The same thing happens in our human beings. Basically emulate our innate natural ability, which is we are parsing them into the same idea of phoneme syllables and the words here. And these are the different things that come out of the midbrain. But once you get the word, then the next thing is you can then parse it into nouns and verbs and create a class. And then you can take one class and combine it to another class and make it a subject, predicate, object sentence. And then you can put conjunctions and do all kinds of other grammatical features and turn them into long sentences, paragraphs, and stories, right? But all of those things happen in the upper level brain, in the mental brain, as symbolic manipulation. That is beyond this, my discussion here. In terms of the lower level organization, in the midbrain, this is what I call as neuronal language. And this is not specific just to communication language. Even if I want to just get up from my chair and walk, okay, so getting up is raising the potential energy, and then swinging my leg is the kinetic energy. And that portion, that kinetic potential energy, kinetic energy is like a syllable. And then if I take one step and take two steps, then that becomes walking here. So you can see the neuronal language is very common, and it is there in a lot of lower level organisms. And this is where the brain started. And that's why right in the beginning, I said, you cannot understand biology without studying evolution. So this is the neuronal language intrinsic to mid-level brain. And then if you make it a super duper symbolic association, you get the human communication brain and becomes the social brain. So, but the point here is the whole thing can be understood with a very simple Markov chain, which is the previous one that I presented here. See, if you think about this equation, you can, if you instead of mn and sn, you can say an plus 1 equals an plus 1 equals an plus an minus 1. And that's the Fibonacci series. The solution for Fibonacci series is the golden ratio. So if you think of it as a simple algebraic equation, this is just Fibonacci series. Okay? If you turn it into vectors and tensors, you can just get into very fancy topology and mapping and all those things. So you can see very simple idea just grows. You can build the whole system. And another thing that these people did, Anita Rupen and Mark Kramer, Nancy Koppel, and Miles Whittington, what they showed was they created a mathematical model of a channel that is multiplexing multiple frequencies. What they showed was if the different frequencies that are going through the channel, if you scale them by this golden ratio frequency, then you have the least amount of interference inside the multiplex channel. It's just very interesting. I'm not saying that the creator of the nature did all these calculations and did this, came up with this ratio. This simple sequence of, or rather, what I'm saying is, it is an output. The golden ratio is a number that's just an output that came out of this fundamental Markov chain or the Fibonacci series algorithm. If people had used different number systems, you'll have a different number value there. Anyway, the idea is this kind of scaling is so beautiful. Okay. I have a couple of other slides. Do you want me to go through or stop here for discussion? Or how do
we can give the time to Jerry for Jerry's presentation, and then we will do the rest after.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah. Sorry, Jerry, it took too long. I'm sorry.
Jerry, your turn.
Well, yeah, I'm not. I wonder if it might be wise to reschedule another session.
Yes, I was thinking about that too, because I think I like both presentations. For Benjamin, I think I can contribute something to improve his consideration about the feedback into, it's just one type of circularity. But I have done a framework of exactly 12 different kinds of circularities, feedback, feed forward, feed up, feed down, and feed left, and feed right. And multiply both negative versus positive. You have 12 types in total in the very complex systems. You can capture. For RAM, I think thinking on the same direction, I also have a 3-dimension model, which is an important difference with RAM that I will try to share mine to him. but anyway, we need a session to discuss.
Okay. So let me say a couple of words then in response to both Benjamin and Ram's presentations, without going into what I was going to say, but just...
We schedule another one, yeah, definitely.
Right, but I have a couple of comments that are really at the heart of my presentation, but I don't want to, I just want to present the concepts here, and then we can talk about them when I do it. But the first one is that I take a very, very radical view of mathematics, and I do this because, I do this because the atomic numbers, which are the foundation, which are physically determined from Coulomb's law and from Newton's law, together generate the data that gives you the atomic numbers as a system of numbers. And this, in turn, generates the entire logic of chemistry. Comes, much as Ram wishes to compose objects, higher and higher objects, comparably with the atomic numbers, you can compose higher and higher objects. We give them names that Ram used for atoms, molecules, catalysts, transmitters, cells, etc. So Ram is using that language, but I'm taking it from a lower level and moving upward from physical rules and a particular form of logic. Okay, and so the second thing I want to point out is that there is within the realm of chemistry a separate and distinct language and logic that is used to describe biology. And that is what we call molecular biology.
Right.
Okay. And so both presenters more or less assumed as background set theory and classical logic of conjunction, disjunction, conditional forward motion, and biconditional logic and negation as the foundational logical operations. None of those are exactly the same in chemistry. Okay, none of those logical operations are exactly the same operations in chemistry. And so that was the essence of what I wanted to talk about. But I'll give people a chance to think about that, and I can send the slides out to the presenters if they wish.
Sure.
So the issue then becomes so after doing this now for half a century, which is what I've been thinking about, because I'm concerned about public health, and that's the goal, the purpose of my work is to deal with public health issues from environmental contaminants, from basic observations. And this started back with my PhD thesis on the cybernetics of feedback and feed-forward relationships. Okay, so mine is grounded, the thinking has been grounded in cybernetics for some more than 50 years. And this is what leads to these radical conclusions. Now, the crucial thing that's come about in the last 2-3 years is that I now understand finally enough about the mathematics of how the atomic numbers, the consequences of atomic numbers can map to the real number system. And this is really the crucial issue that I wanted to describe, and which I will describe, is how that works such that you can map, and these are different from Ram's mappings by far, but the mapping from atomic numbers to, if you would, the real number system. These are very, very different number systems. So I'm looking at this from a very fundamentally, profoundly different way. Okay, so that's, and it involves grammar. You have to have the grammar involved.
Right.
So the grammar of chemistry is different. And Jason, I see you struggling with the grammar that Ram was using. I mean, he uses it in a very sophisticated
I don't
way.
speak English. I think a different language.
That's all good. I mean, so anyway, that's what I wanted to say. And just to alert you where I go, I can send the slides out when we get something set
send
up.
the slides.
Yes, please.
And we need to decide when you want to do this, the follow-up session of this one. When? Jerry, you say first because you will be the first presentation. Pick up one.
I'm done. I can do it anytime. So let other people.
Anytime? Okay.
Well,
so
basically, yeah.
Remy, Ben, when do you want to do this?
Oh, anytime is fine for me.
Another one, anytime. And Ben?
Yeah, I'm pretty flexible the next few weeks, so next month, so whatever works for everybody.
Our next session is for the Oxford project meeting is on 15th. So how about 1 week after that?
That sounds good.
Or you want to do it the week before? Because this presentation is ready, right?
Okay.
No. The reason is I don't have to prepare anything. I just need to listen.
Okay. So 1 week before, like 7th, 7 or 8?
8th, right? 8th, right?
8th? Okay.
Is it okay with Jerry?
It is okay. It's just because it's just the way.
I'm anxious to hear.
Interested. So it doesn't matter if other ladies weren't interested. That's okay. So 8. We are going to do the 8, right?
Okay.
Agree. Okay. Jerry will do the first presentation. I will do the second presentation to offering some probably interactions with Ram and Ben. And how about Igor? You want to do something?
I'm afraid on the 8th it's not an option for me.
Oh, 8th is not an option?
No.
But if you want to do something, when it is better? We have meeting
after
at the
the
15th, so it
yes,
should be
after the 15th for me. But hey, guys, you can get together, and if you are kind enough to share the recordings, I will look it up through, and then I will look it up once more
another one.
to understand what you're talking about. And
Okay. So Igor, you will do the third session. We can continue this. This is very
bloody hell, no, the 22nd is off the record as well for me. Sorry.
okay. So we'll find it out. No problem. So on 8th, Jerry and at least we four will get together. And
Okay.
who else will? It doesn't matter. We don't need the audience. We just need our own minds to get a deep conversation. So what else for today? We still have a few minutes.
Yep. I think these
We
topics
want
are
Ram to finish his slides, right?
It's up
You
to
want
you
to
all.
finish your slides, Ram?
Yes.
Okay.
Okay. By the way, your little flip-flop circuit reminds me that I made one of those things as a gift to my ex.
Yeah.
When we got married, I put that circuit into a flashing LED light, and for her to put on her clothes as a decoration. And that's the first one people see in my city. So she was she went out and harvested a lot of eyesight. That was the flip-flop circuit.
Okay.
I'm glad that you link that to the neuron activity.
Okay, I think I have only a couple of more slides. So continuing with, instead of the matrix representation, you can also see it as a statistical operation. That's what I want to show in this slide. That is, we can think of a system consisting of parts. This is a whole, it has parts in it, but this itself, the parts themselves could be subsystems too. But anyway, this is a system, and it is going through continuous change, and the continuous change, you can think of it as an exponential distribution, and it is acted upon by a discrete Poisson input, and these inputs could be very similar other systems that are sending their signals into this, okay, or it could be just one other system. So there is interaction happening from the outside the system. So typically most science deals with just closed systems, fixed boundaries, whereas what we are talking about in life sciences or or if you're talking about modeling a government or an election process or whatever it is, or an organization, they're all open systems where there is a small system subset we are looking at that are being acted upon by a lot of other external agencies. Okay, so this is a Poisson input, and this is an exponential Poisson distribution, exponential distribution. And what I want to show here is mathematically, if you say that if these two distributions are matched, that is, think of this as one neuron sending its output, and all the other neurons are very similar to this. And if they're all working in kind of some unison, then the number of input that is going to come in depends on when all of these things are expressing coherently outside. So the time dimension from this exponential series matches the expected value of the Poisson discrete input. So those two parameters match, there is a very interesting statistical exercise or actually mathematical exercise you can go through by expanding the equation for Poisson distribution and the exponential distribution, and you can show that the output actually becomes a geometric distribution. If these two are lambda and 1 over lambda, then the geometric distribution 1 over 1 plus lambda. And what is interesting is instead of lambda, if you throw in the golden ratio, then this becomes output, again, it becomes a golden ratio. That is, if this is going at phi and this is going to go at phi squared, so the growth again becomes a golden ratio, but that assumes that these two are matched. Okay, so but it is not necessarily true all the time, because sometimes if this is something that I'm doing, there are a lot of other external agencies that are doing that are not really synchronized with me, then this input can swamp and make me do something. Or conversely, if these are weak and I'm very involved with doing something, I could just do my own thing and keep going. So you can have three different types of things: this system doing by itself, or this system being forced by itself, or you could have a nice, beautiful emergent phenomena when the two are matched. And I'm saying when the two are matched, that becomes the golden ratio. Again, you can, point is, the golden ratio shows up from statistics also, when the system goes from one metastable state to another state by going through an avalanche process at criticality. This is the chaos that Ben was talking about. Okay, actually, I didn't realize that was my last slide. So let me go back to my one. Sorry.
Could you go to the last slide?
Yeah.
No,
This one?
yes. It was unclear to me what conditions you were trying to describe here. Are you talking about what's the substrate? The logical substrate, the material substrate that leads to these curves and description.
Oh, it could be anything. For example, this could be a government, and this could be the election input. Right? This could be any type of system. It doesn't have to be a material system.
But it has to be a mathematical.
Eventually, everything is material, right? I mean, government is made of the people, by the people, for the people. So it is material, and then the individuals and brain and everything goes down to atomic scale. It's a
mathematical system. It's some sort of dynamical mathematical system.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
The point here is what happens inside here stays inside here. So this is like Las Vegas. What happens here stays in Vegas. But the state change that is going to happen into this system, influenced by the external agents, is what I'm concerned about. That is, I'm concerned about the interaction between this system doing its own thing when it is acted upon by an external input. How do the two together evolve into a next state?
Okay.
So this is continuing to do. So that is the beauty of this. That is, a neuron, when the biochemistry and the genetics released the substrate and the receptors all formed along this membrane here, and then the vesicles came in and they opened this up, and then this whole area is flooded with sodium ions, and they came in, and the inside is loaded with potassium. Potassium goes out, and the potassium, once it goes out, the sodium depolarizes it, potassium hyperpolarizes it, and it goes into a quiescent period. And then the system going from here to here is in a quiescent period, and it is now ready for the next state.
Yes.
But while describing this, I don't need to get into any biochemistry. I'm just saying that this is how the interaction happens, and this is a statistical, probabilistic process.
Yeah.
Do I make sense?
Yep, understand.
Okay. So interaction is statistical.
The crucial thing here is the property of being a sort of an n-dimensional metastable state.
Yes. The system is in metastable state. Yes, it's going from one metastable state to other. And how did it get kicked by the external agency? And that's what we are modeling. And that's what I'm calling as a system of system, or open system. So that kind of takes me to the first slide here.
Oh, okay. So that's your bridge to openness.
Yes. So what I'm trying to show here is open system model, which actually originally when cybernetics won, people just looked at the velocity feedback at just the system output being fed back. Cybernetics 2 is added an external regulator that was capable of understanding the input-output relationship. But then when we move to the next level of systems modeling, open system modeling, where multiple systems are interacting, this is now like modeling a society. And actually, there are now a lot of interesting papers. In fact, I would share with you folks a couple of papers on socio-cybernetics, and you can they also call it like the third order cybernetics. And I think in the 2021 WOSC meeting, Lefebvre's papers were shared, and I think they talk about socio-cybernetics there. I'll show you that slide. So anyway, this is the open system.
Yeah, Ram, about the year 2000, I published a paper called Third Order Cybernetics.
Okay.
About the year 2000, based on biochemistry of the cell. So I followed.
Yes.
I look forward to seeing these new papers and how they relate. Okay.
Sure. Yeah, I think they relate to the same kind. I'm kind of new to this, so I don't know all the past literature. But one thing I want to show here is, if you want to understand the social cybernetics, since the two interacting systems are independent but interdependent, you need a self-organizing interface in between. And that interface is what I'm saying is a nested parallel processes operating at various spatio-temporal intervals to ascertain interaction. This is what I call as the brain of a system. That doesn't mean the organic brain that we have. That's something that is mapping a system A to system B, or mapping the external agency's input to the agent that is to the system that is being modeled. Okay. So this I just can call it socio-cybernetics. This is a third order system.
Yes, one can. One certainly can.
Yeah, it's all. So that is why when I talked about in the beginning, when we're going from self to society, what I mean by that is cell is like the microscopic level. Self is the mesoscale, which is the foot-pound mass, foot-pound second. Those units that we are using, that's a mesoscale. Then we go to the cosmic scale or the macro scales. So depending on whether you use the microscope or the stethoscope or the telescope, you see different types of interactions.
Yes.
No.
Okay, so
can I put in governance, but not governance, but emergence of governance, right?
Yes.
Why do we need governance on a certain level, right? We have several levels of governance.
Yeah.
And basically, if a system is not in the capacity to deal with the environment, it gets then governance on this level is required, right? And then you need to put in mechanism to do the governing. So basically, censoring, reasoning, and actions, right? And of course all of that. But if you say, okay, I will zoom into this on this particular level, the reasons for governance and the issues of a governance are really similar. And so the methods of governing which develop have very similar logical structure.
Yes.
So basically, what you see in the brain, you can see in a person, in a society.
Yes.
And the interesting part is that we are always talking about the living systems, right?
Yeah.
Now, I'm wondering, is it really, or is it just our lack of capacity to understand the systems, which we do not call living systems, which manifest very similar governance structures, governance needs, governance emergence, governance structures. I don't know. Are they really non-living
systems?
Igor,
I would ask you, when you use this sort of metaphor to describe relationships between levels, how do you relate to that to discrete mathematics versus continuous mathematics?
That's my last line here.
Okay.
Go to the last slide.
Yeah.
Pardon?
I mean, can you go to the last slide? People are talking about your last slide.
Oh, can you see now or no?
You're currently.
Am I sharing?
Yeah,
No?
you are.
Yes, you are sharing.
You are sharing.
Okay, I was just saying the last line here is universe is discrete. It is made up of matter in motion, and continuity is an illusion of mind. Okay. Listen, I don't want to go into a tangent there, but that's what I wanted to respond to Igor is, Igor, what is governance? A government is a living organization because it is made up of people.
Well,
right?
no, I'm not speaking about government. I'm speaking about governance
Governance as a process.
Governance.
Yeah, governance.
Yeah, but that's why you have to go to the systems thinking here. Governance is a process, but the process has to be executed in hardware and in algorithm. So the governance has to be done by creating a government body and defining their charter and letting them function. These three together constitute a system, not one by itself. Right? That is the interconnectedness of everything. And that takes you to the universe, this discrete. So you can go from, like what Jerry was saying, start from atoms and go to black holes.
I didn't say that.
I'm saying that. Sorry.
Interpreted in that sense.
No. You were saying discrete. I was just using the word discrete. Sorry. Yeah.
Well, I have not. How do you define a circle? You have an object with how many squares? Going to the limit is endless, right? So I don't know what if you're calling discrete event, right? Then we need to have a kind of a clock, which gives me step 1, step 2, step 3, right? So exactly. I would like to see the lowest, the fastest clock of them all, which deals with the smallest objects, right? And yes, my perception for that, because I'm really slow, is that it's not discrete, that it's flowing. But I must agree, in the end, it is discrete.
Actually, there is a very, very interesting paper by Bandyopadhyay. He shows this scaling going from 10 to the minus 4 hertz to 10 to the 12 hertz.
Igor,
so there is discrete.
Igor's question, though, is much deeper than what you're responding to, Ram. Igor's question goes really to fundamentally metaphysical issues. And the history of mathematics is much entangled with Igor's question, much entangled. And
okay, I need to listen to you.
Confusion and misinterpretation and misrepresentation.
No problem.
Right, Igor?
I like every kind of discussion because it kind of clarifies my mind, no matter how weak it is today at this certain point of time. So yes, thank you for that.
Rem, would you send your updated slides to us?
Sure. Yeah.
And I will catch Ben to ask him to share.
Sure. Okay.